Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I am your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you're a first-time listener, hit the subscribe button and like the show. We're on YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Today, our special guest is Dr. Aaron Wellman, and he's got really a wealth of information. Right now, he enters his fourth season, I believe, as Indiana's Senior Assistant Athletic Director for football performance. He came to Bloomington after 4 years as the New York Football Giants strength and conditioning coach. And Tony and I will admit we love the Giants. Actually, we're Cowboys fans. Sorry. But hey, you know what? Just in relation to the Giants, there is something about, we'll get into the injury rates of football players, but the fact that Eli Manning played that long and hardly ever got hurt, which amazes the hell out of me. Even though I wasn't a fan, I'm like, this guy gets beat up, he gets up, he doesn't get hurt. So, let's talk a little bit about that, because there are quarterbacks like Jimmy Garoppolo who, if the wind blows, he gets injured. So interesting stuff. Also, Aaron led strength and conditioning programs for 15 years. And for all you strength coaches, listen to this. He was at Michigan from 2011 to 14, San Diego State from 2009 to 10, Ball State University 2004 to 2008. And of course, he's with the New York Football Giants from 2016 to 19. Now, in addition to collaborating with medical staff on injury risk assessments and return to play protocols, Wellman developed and carried out movement screening and anthropometric assessments to determine lean mass and carrying capacity of the athlete's skeleton. And that's the part I find quite fascinating. Aaron earned his degree in exercise science in 1996. He added his master's degree from Indiana in applied sports science in 1998, nutrition science in 2009, and then he got his PhD 2018 from Bond University in Queensland, Australia. So he's got a hell of a background. We'll publish it when we post the podcast, but I want to welcome Aaron Wellman to the show. Thank you, Aaron, for gracing us with your presence.
I appreciate you asking me to come on, and I've followed your work for a long time, and I appreciate your all the input you've had to the field. And so it's a pleasure to be on with you guys.
Hey, can I just say quickly, Aaron, I am a Big Ten guy, but I kind of lean Ohio State. I'm sorry about that. But nevertheless, I'm extremely happy to have you here, my friend.
Well, I appreciate it. It's pretty easy to lean Ohio State, by the way. So, yeah.
Well, Aaron, let's
again, great to be here.
Let's first talk about the muscle to bone ratio. What piqued my interest in this, God, it might have been a Washington Post article or Wall Street Journal. I forget where. I read about it. Yeah, and all of us coming from an exercise physiology background, when you see a new technique or new way of assessing athletes that might be able to predict something, whatever that something is, it always piques our interest. So one, explain to the audience what exactly MBR is, or muscle to bone ratio. Number two, so that's number one. Number two, how you measure it. And number three, the potential applications for it.
Yeah, well, let me give you a little bit of context behind this. I spent, as you mentioned, a little bit in my bio, I spent 19 years in college prior to my 4 years in the NFL. And quite often the question that gets asked in college football, and still was asked 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and still to this day, is simply, how big can this young man get? And when that question's asked, coaches aren't asking how much adipose mass he can put on. They're asking how much lean muscle mass can his skeleton hold. And for years, and still to this day, there's a lot of subjective responses to that, right? And oftentimes, you refer to the coach's eye, right? A coach has had several years of experience, can often make a very accurate subjective guess at where an athlete's final resting point for lean muscle mass will be, but oftentimes they can. And so it's usually based upon frame size. We look at shoulder widths, just as a subjective assessment, shoulder widths, the amount of muscle mass he currently has, how lean is he, what's his training history, what's his nutritional background, things like that. And we make guesses. And quite honestly, I thought when I got to the NFL, those questions would diminish to some degree simply because of the age of the athlete. Now we're not dealing with 18, year olds. We're dealing with 22 to 36 year olds, and in some cases. And so I thought those questions would be diminished a bit, but in fact, they became more prevalent or as prevalent. And so when you're sitting in the draft room and the owner or the GM asks you, you want to move an outside linebacker to defensive end, let's say, and you're going to give them a huge signing bonus to sign them to a 4-year rookie contract, that question is pretty important that you have a fairly accurate answer to. And something besides a subjective yes. And so I spent, 8 to 12 months just researching, and there's not much out there, to be honest with you, researching absolute muscle mass carrying capability of a skeletal frame. Went so far as to look at the cattle industry when they butcher cattle and the weight of the carcass versus the weight of the skeleton. There's some things in the animal kingdom, and it kind of it's all the time I'm searching. And you mentioned Francis Hallway, and I ran across Francis, and Francis has data on 25 years of athletes from the Olympics, from every sport. So that piqued my interest. The other thing was we were playing a Monday night game in San Francisco, and I was getting graded compression socks, knee-high compression socks for every one of our players. And to do that accurately, you need some ankle circumference measures and calf circumference measures. And we had a running back on the team who you guys probably know well, who had the third largest ankle circumference on the team. And this particular individual also has enormous calves, huge quads, glutes, very muscular lower body with a very large lower body skeletal frame. And so that's when things all just kind of came together. And I'm going, you know what? The size of the skeleton has to, in large part, dictate muscle carrying capability of that particular skeleton, which makes complete sense, right? It's logical. Muscles are attached to tendons are attached to bones. And so the skeletal frame will not put on more muscle mass than it's capable of carrying safely. Not only for performance, but to mitigate risk. And so throughout the process, I'm still researching, I'm pulling articles, and at this point, we're 4 years into it. And the muscle to bone ratio, to kind of circle back to the original question, the muscle to bone ratio is simply that. It's the amount of muscle mass per pound of skeletal weight. Okay. So if I've got a 20-pound skeleton and 100 pounds of lean muscle mass, I've got a 5.0 muscle to bone ratio, right? 100 divided by 20. How we measure this is a method of anthropometry. All manual anthropometry. It's not based upon BOD/POD or DEXA, although we are drawing some correlation with DEXA measures. And it's a 5-way fractionation. And for the listeners who don't understand that terminology, something like a BOD/POD, I think that a lot of people are familiar with, is a 2-compartment model, which essentially the BOD/POD gives you fat mass, which is adipose mass, and lean body mass. And the terminology in that particular situation with the BOD/POD, lean body mass means everything that's not fat, which includes muscle weight, the weight of the skin, the weight of the skeleton, organs, any residual mass, anything that's not fat. That's not muscle mass. Sometimes we make the mistake, and I've heard several people make the mistake of calling lean body mass muscle mass. Not the same thing, completely different.
Right.
And so in a 2-compartment model, we still don't know how much muscle mass is on the frame. We get closer to DEXA. DEXA is a 3-compartment model. We get lean mass, we get fat mass, and we get bone mineral content. Bone mineral content in that scenario is not the weight of the skeleton. It's typically about a third of the weight of the actual skeleton. And these measures, these measures were validated. This is the only method validated with complete dissection of cadavers. And this was done 40 years ago. So they dissected cadavers, put in their constituent pieces, kind of organize this against a phantom model. And they've come up with algorithms to determine 5-way fractionation. So in other words, when we do these measures, and it's about 24 to 25 anthropometric measures, we're getting the weight of 5 different compartments. And those 5 compartments, if valid, would add up the entire weight of the individual's body mass. So the 5 compartments are adipose, skeletal weight, muscle mass, weight of the skin, and then organs and residual mass. And the organs and residual mass, obviously you're not weighing organs. That was what the phantom model was used for years ago, to determine kind of in a body frame of this size, here's the typical weight of the organs and the residual mass. From that, so now we have absolute measures. We have an absolute measure of the skeletal weight. We have an absolute measure of the muscle mass. We have an absolute measure of the adipose mass of the individual. From there, that's how we determine the muscle to bone ratio. So in other words, again, I'll go back to that. If I've got a 20-pound skeleton and 100 pounds of muscle mass on the individual, that's a 5.0 muscle to bone ratio. Now, that in and of itself doesn't mean a whole lot. We find there are two primary factors, and there could be more, but there's two primary factors that determine how much muscle mass an individual can hold. And those are simply the weight of the skeleton and the ethnicity of the individual. African Americans can hold 5.9 to 6.0 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. Certainly, like every other calculation and every other cohort or population, there are outliers to that. Caucasians, about 5.5 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. Polynesians are somewhere in between. Based upon our data set, they're somewhere in between. I'll say this a lot of times, I think, in this podcast, that the strength coach in me feels very strongly about a lot of the things I'm saying almost as factual. The scientist in me says we need more data, right? So with some of the South Pacific Islanders and Polynesians, we need a little more data, but they fall somewhere in between those two ranges. The application is what's exciting to me as performance specialists. So what we've done is, and so we can work in terms of maximal. When a coach says, or practitioner says, how much weight can this athlete hold? We can work in terms of maximal, certainly. And if you're a bodybuilder, a power lifter, a shot putter, in American football, if you're on the interior offensive line or interior defensive line, then certainly we can talk about maximals. Outside of that, we need to start talking about optimals. What's the optimal muscle to bone ratio for this athlete and for their not only sporting demands, but within the sport, their position specific demand. And we find, and based upon years of Olympic data, I'll give you an example. Like a triathlete would be about a 3.5 to 3.6 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. That's optimal based upon medal winners in the Olympics. English Premier Soccer players are going to be between 4.2 and 4.5 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. So you can see the higher the demand for movement, the lower the optimal muscle to bone ratio for that particular athlete or for that particular sport typically is. Again, there are outliers to everything. So one of our goals 3 or 4 years ago was to determine optimal muscle to bone ratios. And in football, we've got several different positions, a lot of different position specific demands. What are the optimal muscle to bone ratios for football players by position? And certainly it varies as an individual as well. Well, what did we look to? We had shot putters and discus throwers from the Olympics. We had rugby league, every position in rugby league. What we didn't have was American football. And so we had to establish these. And so for the last 4 years, we've measured senior bowls, combine class, two NFL combine classes, 8 to 10 full or partial rosters of NFL teams, NBA teams, NHL teams, Major League Baseball teams. So we've got more data points, probably, I feel confident about that than anyone with these particular measures. So now we've established, and not to mention college football teams, our school here, there's several teams we're getting calls from in college that want this done. And so we've recruited a lot of data. And then we follow up today with practical applications for these schools because we do have the data. And I'll give you an example. And most of this is anecdote. We've not published any studies. Right now, I'm in the middle of my PhD number 2, looking at the anthropometric characteristics of college football athletes.
Excuse me, Aaron, when you say PhD number 2, you're actually getting a second doctorate?
Yeah, I'm getting a second one. Don't ask me why. It's one.
Well, no,
my wife.
Tony's more or less done the same thing with multiple doctorates, which I find fascinating, but then again, I'm thinking, wow, you're quite a glutton for
Yeah, and that's what it is.
academic punishment.
I think that's what it is, Tony. Don't you think? It's just
Absolutely, Aaron. But I will say this, I didn't have as much as you going on at the time I was doing it. So credit to
well,
you.
and that's the thing for me is the balance of it all. You know, the PhD work typically happens at 2:30 or 3 in the morning or Saturday or Sunday nights, right? But we'll find a way to get it done. But I think it's that, Tony. I think it's just we're always chasing something. We're always chasing knowledge, and
Exactly.
for me, that's what it is. I mean, it's just constantly trying to seek improvement. And
Aaron, sorry for the sidebar question, because this is absolutely fascinating.
It is.
I mean, just hearing you explain this, you can come up with 1,000,001 questions. So my first question, and I don't know if you know the answer, but perhaps speculate. What athletes have just the highest amount of muscle mass? And if I were to venture a guess, I would say sumo wrestlers, just because they're the heaviest and they carry the most mass. So maybe they have the most skeletal muscle mass. And is there a limit in the human body to how much muscle mass you could put on? Whereas anything above and beyond that, certainly from an evolution standpoint, just wouldn't make sense, because the human body, we're basically hunter-gatherers, and that we're really endurance creatures. We're not creatures that should carry a lot of mass. So I guess first question is, we know the maximum amount a human has ever carried. I'm guessing sumo wrestlers, but again, I don't know. And two, I find it fascinating, the differences between Caucasians, Polynesians, and that was one of my questions about, if Polynesians were somewhere, either closer to whites or blacks. And these are Black Americans that you measured. These aren't Black Caribbeans or Black Africans, because there might be a difference there.
Correct. And we do have African Americans from other continents, but not enough of a data set to determine that. To answer your first question, I would, as far as athletes, I would say sumo wrestlers probably have the most, although we've not measured any sumo wrestlers. I would love to measure those guys. Now, secondly, as you mentioned, historically, muscle is metabolically active tissue, and there's a cost, right? Just us sitting here talking, if we're more heavily muscle, there is a cost to a caloric expenditure associated with greater muscle mass. So our biologically, we would prefer not to carry that much muscle mass. There is a limit. And again, there's a caveat to that. If professional bodybuilders are considered athletes, and I would consider them athletes, I don't know the limit. We've measured bodybuilders above 7.5 muscle to bone ratios.
Wow.
Now, there's a reason for that. Presumably, performance enhancing drugs move the ceiling, the biological ceiling, to points where I don't know that we know the answer to that. But those are super physiological doses of compounds that allow for that to happen. Within normal physiology, there's a limit. What we see is when athletes get to the top end of the limit, they can continue to put on body mass, but that mass is primarily adipose mass. So there appears to be a ceiling or a set point of which, and I'll give you a couple of anecdotes, which will kind of circle back and tie this together. There appears to be a ceiling with which the skeletal frame, it's kind of like a governor, right? To protect us from injury, protect us from, rupturing tendons, avulsing tendons off of attachments. We put a governor on how much muscle mass we can hold as a human so that we don't injure ourselves. Let me give an example. And EXOS is, in my opinion, one of the, if not one of the best, if not the best, training facility when you look at combine preparation for athletes. They've been doing it a long time. Mark Verstegen's fabulous. All his staff is great. And so we have a partnership with EXOS. We measure all their combine athletes at every facility, Gulf Breeze, Frisco, Phoenix. Within 48 hours of measuring, they do performance testing. Okay. The question was posed with several of their players who have high muscle to bone ratios. So let's take a linebacker. Linebackers typically in the NFL are 5.3 to 5.5 pounds of muscle for every pound of skeletal weight. So they've got a couple 5'8", 5'9" muscle to bone ratio linebackers. Now, here's what we see with those guys. Here was the question. When we put them on a force plate and do a counter movement jump, they produce some of the highest power outputs. And like we would think, right? However, when we do tests of elasticity, plyometrics, multiple hops, high-speed running, where there's a large elastic component, meaning more of, high-speed running and plyometric, we're really bouncing on the tendon. It's not a muscular force. We're kind of bouncing on the tendon. And we see huge decrements when we call upon the athlete to produce high elasticity in the high muscle to bone ratio athletes. And the question to me was, why do you think that is? I said, I'll tell you why it is. High muscle to bone ratio presumably means you have a light skeleton, a lot of muscle mass packed on that skeleton. When we ask it to perform an elastic, short response, elastic jump or sprint, we're asking them to have a much more tendon involvement than we are a counter movement jump or a squat. So the GTO gets inhibited, right? The Golgi tendon organ is inhibited because why? If it doesn't, the body's scared. Yeah. Right? We may injure ourselves. And so we see these performance decrements in these high muscle to bone ratio athletes in high speed running and plyometric activity. Yeah. Not so much in strength and just a counter movement jump. And we also see through the NFL, anytime I've got a skill player or a big skill player who has a abnormally high muscle to bone ratio, I always ask the strength coach, the trainer, the nutritionist, say, tell me about so-and-so's injury history. And inevitably, 9 out of 10 times, there's a litany of soft tissue injuries associated with that individual. I myself encountered that in New York. We had 2 players in particular that struggled with soft tissue injuries since college. And it wasn't until, now as a strength coach, we never want to talk about losing muscle mass as a strength coach.
No, that's blasphemy.
Right? Yeah, that's blasphemy. And 5 years ago, I would have looked at this podcast and said, that guy's crazy. I can tell you this. In 2 instances, we had a receiver that was a 5.3, and we think receivers are 4.8 to 5.0 muscle to bone ratio. He was a 5.3. He had soft tissue injury since college. He had soft tissue issues his first 3 years in the NFL. And finally, I let him, he was only 6% body fat. This was not a high body fat player. He weighed 200 pounds, and he asked if he could, he said, Coach, I need to play lighter. And a lot of times the athletes will feel this, right? They'll tell you. I said, look, if you play lighter, presumably you're going to lose muscle mass, and all we're going to have is a lighter version of yourself. You're going to lose muscle mass. With that, we're going to lose some strength, some power, some acceleration ability, perhaps some high-end speed. I don't know what this looks like. But inevitably, we let him. He got down to 189. He was 201, 202, got down to 189. Went from a 5.3 muscle to bone ratio down to a 5.05 and had his only injury-free year in the NFL.
Wow.
Since then, has gone back up and now has had 2 season-end injuries.
Yeah.
Aaron, I'm sorry, Tony, go ahead.
No, I just quickly, this is incredible. I mean, really amazing subject matter. So you answered one of my questions, and that related particularly to the velocity, right, of the position. And you said you can get away with maybe a little bit more of the 5.5 on the lineman. And obviously at given points, there's high velocity, but it's not an all-out sprint. Right. And the rate and the speed of contact is diminished to an extent. I mean, because of the distances in which they collide. So you answered that. The faster they're moving, we've got to get that down, it assumes. And one other question too, do you see any relationship between the rate at which so the rate hypothetically that somebody would go from a 5.1 to a 5.5. Now, if the person's a 5.5, but that 5.5 was built from their teenage years and on, might that make a difference than if they come to you who has so much skill and the team says, I need 20 more pounds on this guy or 25 more pounds? Could that be a factor, Aaron, I guess is where I'm going. I only ask that because I've been lifting crap since I'm 8 and I can't get rid of the muscle I want. And I might like to have a much lower ratio, but simultaneously I've done some crazy things and I haven't torn anything.
Yeah, and those are great questions. And again, it's part of this is talent identification.
Okay.
Right. So to get back to your point, if let's say we've got a Caucasian offensive lineman who weighs 300 pounds, and he's at a 5.5 ratio right now. Right now, we're thinking he probably doesn't have much more window of adaptation for increasing muscle mass.
Okay.
If the GM of the particular team or the head coach says, look, he's 300, we need him to play at 325.
Right.
Okay, understand this. We can get him to 325, but the fear is most of that 25-pound gain is going to be adipose.
Right.
That's the fear. Now, in alignment, let's say he's 16% body fat. That might be something you do, because as long as we want our alignment below 25, closer to 20 better. But if we're willing to accept the fact that, you know what, he's going to gain some body fat, and it may have maybe deleterious on his movement quality, and we're still okay with that, then we can do that.
Got it.
All right. Now, you also have the other end of the spectrum where you have certain skill players, receivers, defensive backs. Maybe they're 5'3s, and we say, whoa, it's too high. But he's been in the league for 6 years, and he has no injury history.
Mm-hmm.
Keep him there.
Got it.
You know, there's no reason to go changing, but those are, again, both of those are outliers.
Got it.
And there's outliers with everything. Typically, the 5'3 skill player is going to have some soft tissue injuries associated with it. I just talked to a team who drafted a skill player who's a 5'3 ratio at the combine, and I look back at his history. He had missed half a season with hamstring, tore his ACL. I'm not saying that the muscle to bone ratio solves the riddle of injury or performance, but what I am saying is there's way too many strong anecdotes like this for us to at least not use this as a layer of programming and talent identification for our athletes.
Okay, I have a question, sort of again, another sidebar, because it makes me think, okay, predicting performance and or injuries in a team sport is inordinately difficult just because there's so many factors going on.
Yes.
But what if we took a, quote, simpler sport, someone who runs the 100 in track, and it's purely time-based. There's no one's trying to hit you, no one's tackling you. And if you look at world-class sprinters, and the reason I thought of this was your example of the guy who I think was a receiver, went from 200 to 189 pounds, his muscle to bone ratio dropped. And I'm thinking, well, if you look at world-class sprinters, a lot of them aren't very large. I mean, they're lean, but they're not large guys, yet they move faster than every other human being on planet Earth. So is there a predictive value if you look at world-class sprinters? Because there's always a few that are very muscular, and then the rest are just lean guys who, I mean, they look like they would be wide receivers possibly in the NFL. Is there a predictive value for, one, injuries in track athletes? And I'm not sure if you've worked with track athletes. And two, there's a predictive value in terms of performance. Like, can you just be too muscular to run the 100 in, under 10 seconds?
Great question. I think the predictive value in injury is a longer road and more difficult road, as you know, because you need several hundred injuries.
Right.
Predict. And that's the problem. We do everything we can to keep our athletes healthy. We don't want injuries, but in order to have any predictive value, and that's, like you said, it's multifactorial. You need a lot of injuries. You need measures close to the injuries so you know where he's at. I think the predictive value and performance is better, and that's what, my first paper in the PhD was more of a literature review. Paper number 3 is going to be that. It's going to be what anthropometric characteristics predict performance in college football players. Performance not being on the field, because again, there's a lot of factors that go into that. Performance being 10-yard sprint times, 20-yard times, vertical jump, broad jump, change of direction drills. Now, we can tell you that, history leaves clues, right? So the 100-meter sprinters in the Olympic Games, last 25 years of data, show that the average muscle to bone ratio of an Olympic 100-meter sprinter is about 4.6 to 4.7 pounds of muscle per pound skeletal weight.
Interesting.
So your assessment is exactly right. We think NFL receivers are about 4.8 to 5.0. Now, why are they? I train my receivers like Olympic sprinters, but they have to have a little more muscle. Why? Because there's some more changes. So there's a little more of a strength component with hard changes, directions, excels and decel, and not to mention blunt force trauma associated with contacts and contact with the ground and opponents. So they have to have a little more muscle. Sprinters, straight line, no contact, no change of direction, 4.6, 4.7. Why is that? Well, presumably, and NFL receivers will tell you this too, if they get, and again, I don't want to go on a tangent or a rant, but in the U.S., the strength conditioning coach, and part of it is we call him a strength coach. Their value lies in, I got his squat. Hey, look, I know, hey, he didn't play very well, but his squat max went from 4 to 5. Maybe that's why he didn't play really well.
Exactly.
Well, look, coach, he's not playing well. But hey, look, he put on 5 pounds of muscle this offseason. Maybe that's why he's not playing well.
Now, Aaron,
so
this is fascinating because what you're saying runs counter to 99.999% of strength coaches, where, hey, I got you stronger, I put muscle mass on. It's got to be the coach's fault that you're not playing well. So, no, this is awesome. This is awesome.
It does, and we never want to like. I never want to. We always want to get our players stronger. We always want them more powerful. We always want them faster, better accelerators. But there's a point when we don't need to keep piling on muscle mass on these individuals.
Exactly.
Particularly the skill positions. Now, strength is very well correlated with acceleration ability. So the lighter you are and the stronger you are, typically the faster 5 and 10 yard time you have. It doesn't extend, unfortunately, much beyond that. 100-meter sprinter, the strongest guy isn't the fastest at 60 meters, but he might be the fastest out of the blocks the first 3 to 5 meters. But these guys will tell you that again, 10 years ago, I would have said to a receiver, as long as you put on muscle mass, you won't get slower. As long as you don't put on fat mass, as long as it's not adipose, as long as it's not as long as it's functional muscle mass, you'll continue to get faster, or at least stay the same speed. Until I saw that not happening.
Right.
Until I saw guys that we trained with hypertrophy methods and heavy strength work and all these things we did, and the guy went from 172 to 185, and his body fat decreased, and he ran slower and didn't jump as high. Well, we put functional muscle mass on him. He got stronger, but his performance didn't improve. And in fact, it got worse sometimes. And so an Olympic sprinter that goes from 4.6 to 5.2 probably won't be an Olympic sprinter anymore.
Right.
And the risk of injury, in my opinion, from what we've seen with the data and talking to teams, increases. And so there's a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot for, again, just the sport itself, the position itself, but also there's inter-individual differences in what that sweet spot is. And so, there may be an Olympic sprinter. I would love to measure all the Olympic sprinters right now. There may be an Olympic sprinter. Like we went through it. You're right, Jose. There's guys who are really muscled up guys, but you look at other guys who they're lean. You can't have high body fat and be an Olympic sprinter.
Right.
You have to. There's no fat Olympic sprinters. That's an oxymoron. They're all lean. They're all strong relative to their body weight.
Yep.
But they're not all heavily muscled. And if muscle were the answer, all of our Olympic sprinters would be fairly heavily muscled. Those would be the elite guys, and they're not. And so, I just want to, I'm not trying to change a paradigm, but this is just what we're finding. I didn't set out to change a paradigm. This is just the data shows this, that there are certain optimal levels of muscle bone ratio by whether it's an Olympic event or by position in football or basketball, whatever it is. But we're finding the elite players falling into these ranges more often than not.
You know what would be interesting, and Tony, I guess a little bit of speculation on your part, since you work with a lot of fighters and also our fellow colleague Corey Peacock, he works with a lot of UFC fighters. If we could measure the muscle to bone ratio in all these fighters and see if there's a relationship between that and maybe their weight cutting protocol in terms of how much can they lose in those last 2 weeks prior to a fight, and if there's some relationship there, because I would imagine, I think if you generally carry more muscle, you have more water weight to lose for one, but
yeah,
it's one of those things where it just makes you think about a lot of other scenarios. And again, the fight sports are more complicated than other sports just because there's so much going on. But
yeah, the fight sport just doesn't allow for the hypertrophy due to the bioenergetic demands and the multifactorial stimulus, right? Because you don't have this explosive 1, 2, 3 repetition or 4 or 5 second play. You have 2-3 minute intervals of striking, grappling. So, I mean, some of that adaptive mechanism is not going to be hypertrophy. In many ways, you're probably counteracting it. But one of the things I'm curious about too, and it led to what you were saying, Joey and Aaron, if you could, and this is not asking whether people do or not, but would the rate, I would imagine that it's probably not that easy to achieve your maximum muscle to bone in the absence. I'm not saying people cannot, but obviously a performance enhancement drug and would probably make one far more susceptible to that. If the athlete is not using that, is the adaptive rate more commensurate with what the body could potentially handle? Or even athletes that, are not using that, just whey protein, let's say creatine, they can still be, of course it's genetic, but there are maybe quite a few then, even without any augmenting, performance drugs, that can still hit that maximum ratio. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, I think the average individual, and again, we don't measure average individuals because we're measuring NFL players and
right.
We're measuring elites. And I think the average individual, he may not hit max if he does it all, he or she may not hit the maximum amount of muscle mass till age 28 to 30.
Okay.
With great training, great diet, great supplement protocols. However, again, we're not measuring general population, right? We're measuring
yep.
We're measuring the elite of the elite, and these elite of the elite oftentimes matured at much faster rates. And so we see some maximum. I've got 4 guys right now on a college team that have, by our definition of maximal, are there to their maximum muscle to bone ratio. So a lot of it, what is the endocrine response and testosterone levels when you hit 16, what was your testosterone level? How did you train? What was your nutrition like when you're age 16? Sleep patterns. There's a lot of things to consider, but you've seen these guys. I mean, I've had freshmen come in, and after 4 weeks have put on 12 to 15 pounds of lean muscle mass and really got scared and had to slow them down.
Right.
Because these were defensive backs that went from 195 to 210 pounds in 4 weeks.
Wow.
Just because proper training, and they had never, dinner for the last 6 years of their lives was, whatever they could get at the dime store on, in the evening. And so they get proper nutrition, they just grow quickly. And so I think the elite of the elite, these elites are hyper responders, as you guys know.
Makes sense.
To every stimuli, right? To food, to sleep,
Right.
to training, to everything. And so we see that, and typically, and I'll give you an example, the skill players that are at these maximal levels already, or at least at the upper end of the range, we do program training and nutrition interventions to deter them from gaining more muscle mass. So we try to stay away from hypertrophic stimuli in the weight room. We try to stay away from a bunch of eccentric work. So in other words,
Right.
if the rest of the team's squatting, you may do a hex bar deadlift, concentric only, drop it out of the top and do some explosive work right afterwards. EXOS has got a really great take on this. They're doing, we've all seen some of the research on post resistance training, cold therapy, and how it may blunt the inflammatory response and hence also blunt the response to hypertrophy in particular. And so there's some of these high muscle to bone ratio guys. What are they doing? They're training them for strength and power and put them in the cold tubs afterwards.
Right.
Or they're trying some nutritional interventions. And I don't know how efficacious it is, but presumably if we're looking at things like tart cherry juice and vitamin C and turmeric that potentially blunt the inflammatory, reduce inflammation, they're doing some of that in the post-workout window as well, just to try some things. And so very interesting. And they've had some they're kind of a training ground for us right now. They've had some great results and with some interventions they've been doing with these guys.
Now, quickly, Joey, I just wanted to add that I've had to do that with a handful of fighters due to the greater potential for hypertrophic response. I use largely concentric and I try to mitigate hypertrophy and threw them in an ice bath afterwards.
Yeah,
I feel better about it now.
And that's it. And again, like I don't have a randomized controlled study on that, but
Nor do I. Yeah.
and again, like, oftentimes the science follows, but logically, the return on investment could be great, and the any deleterious effects seems to be minimal. So logically, it makes sense to do that with these guys. Now, these measures just now give you an objective reason why you're programming those things, or why the nutritional interventions are the way they are. So,
no, I mean, Tony, we do know there is data that the cold water immersion does blunt muscle protein synthesis. So it actually makes sense if you're not bodybuilding, that, obviously with fighters are not bodybuilding, that it would be a good strategy. And it seems to decrease delayed onset muscle soreness too. So fighters can, get back in the gym the next day. Now, I do have a speculative question for you, Aaron.
okay.
Really a mechanistic one. Why are there differences between Caucasians, Polynesians, and Black Americans in terms of the MBR?
I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if I want to speculate either.
Because here's what's fascinating. When you look at the numbers in the NFL, and even, not so much college, but in the NFL, the group that's actually most overrepresented are Polynesians, because they come from such a tiny island. I think like 58,000 live in Samoa. And yet you see these athletes trickling into the NFL. It's more or less, it's like they came from a small town in Iowa, and all of a sudden these players from a small town in Iowa show up in the NFL. So there's something odd going on in these tiny Polynesian islands that's different than anywhere else in the world.
Right. And you see what we do see is a large discrepancy in bone breadths in Polynesians. Meaning, in some of to get the weight of the skeleton, I'll just give an example. We measure shoulder breadth. These aren't circumference measures, these are breadth measures. So large calipers, shoulder breadth. We do a transverse chest. We do an anterior posterior chest. We do a biiliocristal, so the breadth of the hips.
Okay.
We do the breadth of the distal end of the humerus, and we do the distal end of the femur. And that gives us the weight of the skeleton. All right. And we see huge discrepancies particularly in lower body of the Polynesians. Very large femur breadths, very large hip breadths comparative to their constituents at the same position that are African American or Caucasian. So just very large, big skeletons. Now, their muscle to bone ratios fall in between the African Americans and the Caucasians. They're not quite as heavily muscled. However, their frames are huge. Big, thick skeletons, and I'm making generalizations here across the population. But now, and again, the guys at the elite level in the NFL, obviously, we see these huge skeletons in these guys, and oftentimes, if you look at, if you just look in, and I wish we could very easily find the data. I haven't ran the data. The data on how many of these Polynesians in the NFL are at the O-line, D-line, linebacker, fullback position versus wide receiver, defensive back.
Right.
Most of them fall into the former. The larger, the lineman, the O-line, the D lineman. Everyone, fullback is kind of a dying breed in the NFL, but linebackers, because of that, because they have such large, these are large men who have large skeletons suited for higher body masses and these positions that rely on just blunt force and less speed, let's just say. Now there's several certainly Polynesians that are wide receivers and defensive back as well, but the representation in the NFL, if I were to generalize, I would say lies in that O-line, D-line, larger body mass population.
Yeah, it seems that way. Other than, I can only think of Troy Polamalu, who played for the Steelers.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was Tiasasopo? I think, what was his name? Tiasasopo, I think. He was I think he was Samoan as well, and he was a back or a D-back, something like that. But other than that, you're right. I think of all the guys, usually you see them with the long hair right on that D-line or the O-line, right?
Yeah. Very, very large frames. the bone breadths on those guys are, and the ankles and the distal femurs and the hip width, very large comparative to their positional.
Aaron, where you're going to publish data on the MBR? Is it coming out soon? Because certainly I'd love to read it. I know Tony would love to read it. If there's a way we can apply this to fighters, I think it would be fascinating.
Yeah, it's well, you know how the publication process works.
Yeah, of course. You submitted it last year, right?
Yeah, right. I haven't submitted it yet. We're in the process of doing that right now.
Okay.
But I've had great conversations with WWE and Duncan French, who I love Duncan. I've known Duncan for a long time. Great person, great mind.
Yeah, we know him well. Good man.
Yeah, Duncan's great. We've had some great conversations with UFC about these things, about what weight class, how much weight to cut, things you just brought up that you elucidated, 5-10 minutes ago. The other thing is too, and I'm not, Tony, you know much more about MMA and this type of sport that I do, but also, the conversation with Duncan was, it also depends on the style of the fighter a little bit, right?
Absolutely.
Ground and pound versus another style. I mean, so I told Duncan, it's fascinating to me to get those guys measured, because it's not just ethnicity or weight class, it's also style.
Yep, you're exactly right, Aaron. It's style, and the prototypes are not the same, because you can get a guy 6'1" to make $155, and you can get a guy 5'7" at 155 who wrestled for Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and has years of grabbing other human beings, resistance training. So, it's a little bit more challenging, because in the NFL, like you said, it better than anyone. Well, generally your lineman's going to be this height and this weight range as a guard, tackle. We don't have that in fighting. Boxing would be more consistent with that, because
Right.
It's a reach sport. But anyway, it's just fascinating. What you're doing here will have implications in every sport. Tennis, the whole bunch of things to look at. It's really fantastic information.
And one thing that surprised me in the NBA was, you wouldn't, having not ever coached in the NBA, I didn't think this conversation would be as prevalent, but it is. And several NBA organizations have reached out, and their general managers and coaches want to know how much more muscle mass can this player have on them. And in the NBA, the problems most teams, or a lot of teams, are facing in the NBA, certainly I don't want to speak for performance directors in the NBA, is that these guys that are rookies play their college season, which begins in October and then ends in March. Then they declare for the draft, and so they go to pre-draft training. Then they go to the combine. Then they get drafted. Then they play summer league. Then they play an NBA season.
Wow.
So they end up playing, 18, 19 months straight.
That's crazy. Yeah.
And so what do you see? We see some chronicity with the injuries, stress fractures, fifth met, a lot of stress reactions and stress fractures in the feet. And so the question they're asking is, okay, with these rookies, finding that we can't, the chronic loading is not going to change within that paradigm of, if I declare for the draft, I have to get ready for the combine, then I have to play summer league, then I go right. That's probably not going to change. So what can we change? Is there something we can do from a muscle to bone ratio standpoint, or an absolute adipose mass that would give this particular individual a little bit more resiliency, a little bit more robustness to handle? Although 18 months of training is a lot to handle for anyone, but
exactly
type of training. And so I think the NBA is they're asking the same questions as a lot of teams are in a lot of other sports.
Do you have a guess on what, or any numbers on what you think? Would they be like a 4-5? Do we know at all, or?
Yeah, we've measured 3 NBA teams, and it's very similar. You've got some distinct differences between a point guard, a shooting guard versus a power forward versus a center. And right now, because the rosters are so small, we don't have, I don't feel good about giving you absolutes like I do in the NFL, because the roster is so small. But an NBA point guard is more like a sprinter in terms of muscle to bone ratio, that mid 4s. Again, although the NBA, if you watch the playoffs, there's quite a bit of contact in the NBA, but not to the extent of football, obviously. And so it's a sport where those muscle to bone ratios lie more on the lower range, like a sprinter, than they would as a defensive back or now the power forwards, a little higher muscle to bone ratio, and the centers, as you would guess, a little higher muscle to bone ratio. And those guys, again, you're dealing with 6'10" to 7 foot centers, very large skeletons. And again, those guys can put on more muscle mass, but the question will be, it's not as simple as, can he? Okay, then let's do it. It's what's his performance look like? What's his injury history? Right? Because we're trying to do, I mean, number one, we want to mitigate injuries. That's number one, but also we want them to perform. If they're healthy enough to play, then we want them to perform. So that's a close second, but we need the players available. And so that's kind of the holy grail, right? In sports is how do we mitigate risk? We're not going to prevent injuries, but how do we mitigate risk? And this is certainly one of those kind of layers to that.
Aaron, we want to be respectful of your time. We only have a few minutes. Just sort of a selfish question. If it's possible to send Tony and I the methodology for this, because I think we could test a lot of the fighters that you work with, Tony, and also Corey Peacock. He works with a lot of fighters, and it would just be additional data on an elite group of athletes. So that's one. And number two, it's sort of a final question. If you have MBR data on quarterbacks, and the only reason I ask that is you worked with Eli Manning, who played, I don't know how many years, he played a lot, and he rarely got hurt, even though he was getting beat up back there. And yet there's other guys who play the position who seem to be hurt every year. And maybe it's the style of play or whatnot, but I don't know. I saw Eli Manning get crushed a lot, and he just get up, and I was like, this guy's made of steel. I mean,
insight, you really appreciate what he did. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, I saw him get crushed a lot too, unfortunately. I'll say this. Yes, the answer, yes, we do have muscle bone ratio on quarterbacks. Now, quarterback's an interesting one because style of offense dictates oftentimes the type of player you draft. So Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia,
right?
His muscle, and we've measured Jalen, his muscle bone ratio is quite different from another quarterback who's a drop back passer, like Eli was. Now, Eli, part of his, one, genetically very gifted. Two, very smart player. Eli knew when to get down. Eli he took some hard hits, but he took a lot of glancing blows because he was smart to get down. The other thing I'll say about Eli, this is the most consistent athlete I've ever worked with.
Wow. From
everything he did. So at Thursday at 5:00, I knew where to find Eli in season. That was never going to change. Wednesday morning at 6:15, I knew where Eli was going to be. That never changes. Every single morning, he has the same thing for breakfast, the same thing for lunch. He's going to have the same thing for dinner. If it's a night game, I know exactly when he's going to eat breakfast. I know he's going to have oatmeal with fruit in it. He's going to have an 8-white omelet. So Eli was so regimented for however many years in the league, 15, 16 years in the league. Most guys, you don't see that of a lot of guys that are that regimented with their recovery and their daily routine. He had his daily routine down. And so that goes a long way because, again, that ties into when he went to bed, when he woke up. And so everything for Eli was calculated. And so that all those things combined, I think, for Eli went such a long way. But great competitor, great person, tremendously resilient his whole career. But yeah, we do have muscle to bone ratios on quarterbacks. The average quarterback is about 4'8", 4'7", less than. It's the lowest of all the positions, but you do have some guys that are 5.0. If you need a guy to run the football, he's going to be a more heavily muscled. And we all know Jalen Hurts was a 600-pound squatter and height. So obviously he has more muscle in his frame.
Or a Josh Allen's probably a little higher, yeah.
Yeah, Josh Allen probably is too. Josh Allen's a big guy. But again, if he has a big, heavy skeleton, his muscle to bone ratio may not be that high. I mean, he just
right.
A big, heavy skeleton player. So that's why it's important to do the measures and kind of find out where these guys are. But we've had the fortune to measure a lot of good quarterbacks in the NFL, and the average quarterback in the NFL right now is about 4'7". And depending on style of play, you know, when we consult with teams and try to give them advice on where certain individuals should fall, that's a big part of the equation is style of play and previous injury history.
No, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. You don't often get exposed to, you know, like new techniques and whatnot. And I think in the anthropometric field, certainly this is it. Tony, I don't know if you have any final questions for Aaron, because
No, just some final thoughts. History is filled with people who never wanted to change a paradigm, but they did. And you just might be doing it whether you intend on it or not. And this is fascinating. I think what you're doing here, Aaron, is tremendous for all of us in all sport. And I mean that from my heart. And I'm not sure if we've had a show yet, Joey, that requires a part 2 more than this one. So incredible information and enlightening, and really, really neat to hear and learn.
yeah, I never actually got to questions about what you guys do in college in terms of recovery or whatnot, because I was so interested in the muscle to bone ratio data that, and that's fine. You know, the fact that we talked about this for the entire podcast is perfectly reasonable, because I think this information needs to get out. And, you know I look forward to your paper coming out. I mean, you know, just get it out there, and because we all want to see it. We all want to see it.
Yeah. Well, it's up to the JSCR, so hopefully we'll get that. Hopefully we'll get it soon.
Okay, yeah, I know how fast they work. So, God, it may not be till next year.
No, I have confidence in them. But look, it was fantastic to be on with you guys, and my pleasure, privilege for me. And keep up the great work. You guys are doing great work as well.
Hey, thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. You have a great day.
Thank you for everything.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thanks.